I underwent this week a technical job interview that was so unbelievably brutal, it nearly brought me to tears. I'm pissed off, which means you better strap yourself in, cause it's time for another rant. And I can already hear the critics in the comments saying, oh, why would you even be bothering applying for a AAA studio that uses C++ when you know that you haven't touched this language in years? It was never anything you've forgotten these fundamentals that are taught in every first-year computer science document. And it's so like, well, you know, I applied too many. And then you go to do a test on whatever you just learned. It's like, gee, I wonder what's on the test. Does that have anything to do with the last few questions or the last few classes we spent learning the dot product? Oh, hey, here's a math question. I wonder what the solution is. Let's use the dot product. Ding dong YouTube, welcome back to the channel. I'm the Jobless Coder, and today we're going to be discussing all of the ways that companies use absolutely bullshit coding tests to outright deny otherwise very smart, very intelligent, very creative, very well-educated, very talented, and very passionate people jobs that they absolutely deserve to have. This is the boat that I'm finding myself in, the situation that I'm in. There are a great many things that I can speculate on as to reasons why I am just unable to get a job anywhere for anyone doing anything at any position at any company for any amount of pay anywhere in the world. One of those reasons that I do know for a fact is that I just simply cannot pass the mythical whiteboard interview. Now, for some clarity, in this video, I am referring specifically to what is known as the whiteboard interview in tech. I don't have a problem at all with a company determining your level of coding ability by sending take-home tests or various different coding tests. I think that's something that you should do, but there is fundamentally a different beast to be slain when you compare that with what is typically known as a whiteboard interview, where prior to COVID, you would have to go into an office and sit with one, if not more people in a boardroom. And the reason it was called a whiteboard interview is because you would often have access to a whiteboard and they would ask you very technical questions about algorithms and code and math, and you would have the ability to write your answers and walk them through your thought process on the whiteboard. This is absolutely different in all regards to a take-home test where you have, say, 3 or 4 technical questions, some problem to solve, and you have 20 minutes, maybe half an hour for each of them, and there's a bunch of different unit tests that are applied to the problem. So you write the code, you run it through the unit test, oh, it failed test number 4, okay, well, let's go and see if we can find where the issue is. And you kind of tinker around with it, and then you come to a solution, all the tests pass, and then you submit it. So when it comes to coding, it is a skill that requires a lot of mental thought process that goes into it, a lot of concentration and thinking. And some people just simply can't do it if there's someone standing over their shoulder, either physically or metaphorically in terms of a Zoom call, sitting there watching them code. Now, prior to COVID, as I mentioned, these interviews were typically conducted on a whiteboard where you would have the ability to draw massive diagrams and pictures and math equations and walk the interviewers through the thought process that you were going through in your head. But I don't know about you. I don't have a whiteboard anywhere in my working space here, and not everyone does have immediate access to a whiteboard. And because all of the jobs that are conducted for tech companies in recent years are done almost exclusively through online video conferencing software that is used to conduct these interviews, you have to try to construct these same diagrams in your head and then try to describe verbally to the person interviewing you what it is that you're thinking. And it makes it exceptionally more difficult for people to pass these interviews. There are circumstances where people would absolutely passed with flying colors on the take-home test because they actually know what they're doing and they know how to code, and then they fail miserably at the whiteboard interview because they simply just can't work by describing what they're thinking in their head verbally and or with other people sitting there watching them. In the whiteboard interview, you're kind of expected to just have the answers right like that, lickety-split, just whatever comes out of your head. And the problem is that generally speaking, the first thing that comes to mind is not necessarily the best or the most correct or the fastest possible algorithm that can be done. And in the take-home test, you have that ability to write out the code and then go back over the code and say, oh, look here and here and these, I made these mistakes here and there, and fix it up. But in the whiteboard interview, where you're just expected to ramble the answers off lickety-split, you don't have that opportunity. Which brings me to my first major criticism against the standard whiteboard interview, which is that they don't reflect at all in any way the day-to-day job that you'll be performing for the particular company. Most of the questions, for example, on a whiteboard interview tend to be very technical, algorithmically based, mathematically challenging questions that were pulled from some random university textbook. And you will almost never, in any circumstances at all, in production code, be writing these algorithms from scratch. No one's going to expect you to write a sorting algorithm from scratch for a linked list. No one's going to expect you to write some kind of A-star search algorithm from scratch, because you're going to have a suite of tools that are AI tools that were either bought from some package on the Unity store or were already developed by the developers who built the engine from scratch that you're using at, say, a AAA studio, and you're going to be using those tools. You're not going to be writing these tools from scratch. But the problem is that the questions that are posed to you in the technical whiteboard interview are all about very low-level, fundamental technicalities that you maybe learned years and years and years ago in school and have since forgotten how to do from scratch, because there's a whole suite of tools in reality that are used instead. The other fundamental reason that the whiteboard interview is a pretty terrible way of assessing a candidate's ability to work a job or not is that it tells you nothing about how they work under particular pressures or time constraints. How are they going to be when they have 3 different managers coming to them, asking them to do 3 different tasks, and they're a month behind on schedule? Now, I understand that is why these companies tend to do multiple interviews, one of them being more about, who you are as a person, and one of them being more about your personality and how you would fit into their company culture, and then the other ones being more technically inclined. Do you actually know the skills? Do you have the ability to be a productive employee? Things of that nature. But the problem is that the whiteboard interview doesn't align at all with how the job is actually performed. If you're working for a company, at least any decent company that's worth working for, your boss is not going to be standing there hovering over your shoulder watching you code, and you're sitting there like the sweat dripping down your brow, where you're like, oh my god, if I fail this one coding test, I'm gonna get fired, my boss is gonna hate me, the whole company's gonna collapse. You're not going to really experience that. So to be put into that situation where you're sitting in front of one or more people and you're coding for them live and you're making a lot of mistakes, it is extremely stressful to be in that position. And I personally don't think that if you're, nervous or unable to code under that level of pressure, that means you're just a bad coder or you don't know what you're doing. And that brings me to probably the biggest criticism of all that I have about the whiteboard interview, which is that virtually none of them, for any company that you interview, are going to allow you the use of Google. And I don't think that Google is cheating, because I don't give a fuck who you are. I don't care if you're Mark Zuckerberg or John fucking Carmack. There isn't a single person in this industry from the top all the way to the bottom who isn't consulting with Google at least 10 times a day for something that they just don't know or that they just don't remember right now at the forefront of their brain, because there is so much knowledge and learning and skills and algorithms and math that goes into performing programming as a skill set that you just can't keep all of that knowledge all at once in the forefront of your brain. So if a coding interview was to actually assess your ability as an employee to work for the company, they almost always need to give you the ability to reference Google. Because in the real world, if your boss comes to you and says, hey, can you implement this algorithm or this thing? Can you do it? And you say, I don't know, I've never done it before. Let me go to Google and figure it out. That is the correct answer. But instead, in the interview, if you just don't know or you just don't remember a particular algorithm, you're expected to sit there and hem and haw and just blurt whatever garbage comes out of your mouth, which is almost always going to be wrong, and then they look at you like you're a fucking idiot. So if there is one promise that I can make to you, if I ever able to grow my company to a point that I would actually have income and ability to hire other people to work for me, I will never ever conduct a coding interview upon which you are not allowed to consult Google, because I want to know how it is that you work using the tools that are provided. And Google is a tool. It's not a cheat code, because you can have access to Google, and if you just don't know what to Google or how to do it properly or the correct websites to go to, or whether or not a particular answer is actually the correct answer or not once you found it, because a lot of the time the answers you get on Google are just not right, that is a skill set that comes, and that tells me more about your ability to do the job than whether or not you can just memorize questions from a textbook. So that is my pledge to you, is that I will never conduct a coding interview where you're not allowed to use Google. Now, another thing that I don't like about the coding interview, the typical whiteboard interview, is that it is a memorization problem. How much can you memorize about some arbitrary algorithm that was taught in first year university? Because I will tell you one thing for certain. I was in the Air Cadets for 6 years, and I did both scholarships for the pilot course, for the gliding course in 2013 and for the power scholarship in 2014. And part of that involved doing a job-like interview where you had to memorize a lot of technical questions, but you also had to explain to the people that were doing the interview why it is that you specifically should get the pilot's license. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to apply those skills to your squadron once you return from the summer? And I managed to get on these courses that were exceptionally difficult to get into. There was only 60 people from all of Western Canada per year that got to go on this scholarship out of thousands that had applied. So I was able to do that. But the problem is that there's a lot of tests that go into leading up to that, and there are people that got 98, 99, 100% on the test because they are book smart and they have absolute knowledge of the thing. But then they go on the course and they don't know how to fly. It's a particular skill that you have to be able to learn and be able to utilize with your body. And if all you can do is just memorize textbook questions, you're not going to be able to pass the course. And there were some people that were the, let's say, stereotypical Asians, very book smart, very smart at math, 100% on their test. They absolutely failed the pilot course because they could not utilize those skills practically. And that is what I think is more important in the terms of coding, is can you do it practically? Can you make something that practically works? Not can you memorize some algorithm out of a textbook? So by now, you're probably wondering what company it is that I had applied for. And I'm feeling pretty generous today, so I don't think I'm actually going to tell you, because I have no problem at all railing against the company if I think that they have personally wronged me in some way, or they partake in terrible business practices against both the consumer, the customers who buy their games, as well as the developers who work for them, one of which being EA Games. It is an absolute garbage company. It's probably the worst company on the planet. In fact, I think they actually got declared like the worst company to work for in America, and they partake in horrible business practices, not only against their customers who buy their games, but also against the developers who apply for jobs there. And I don't give a flying fuck if they want to put me on a blacklist. I'm sure I'm on a blacklist already. I continue to apply for jobs there regardless, because at the end of the day, a job is a job. And if they gave me a job, I would absolutely go and work for them. But I'm going to criticize them to the nth degree for their business practices. In this particular case, I don't necessarily think it's the company's fault the way that the interview was conducted. It's more of a systemic issue that plagues the entire computer science industry from top to bottom down because of the way that all companies conduct all interviews the exact same way. As well, about this company that I interviewed with, I actually really like them. I don't think they're engaging in overly predatory activities, so I'm not going to criticize them on that particular aspect. And I like their games. I've played their games before. I'm a fan of what they do. And I even told them this in the interview. Prior to the coding interview, there was a screening interview that was trying to assess whether or not you're interested in the company, whether or not it would be a good fit. And I told them straight up, I love your games. I love what you're doing. And I am emotionally invested, not only from the standpoint of a player, but from the standpoint of a developer, in seeing you guys through your redemption arc. That's about all the information I'll give you on what and who the company is, seeing them through their redemption arc. Obviously, there's plenty of companies that have fallen from their good graces that are on a redemption arc path. But I told them that I was motivated and dedicated and excited, and I really wanted to work for them, which is probably one of the reasons that this job interview almost brought me to tears when I knew for a fact that it wasn't going to happen, was because I was so emotionally invested in them. You know, there are a lot of companies that I interview with and they're like, oh, tell us why you want to work for this random company that you've never heard before in your entire life until you saw one job posting on LinkedIn. And it's like, well, gee, I'm sorry, I've never heard of you and I've never played your game, so I guess I'll make up some bullshit answer about why I want to work there so badly. But this company, I actually knew who they were and I had played their games previously, so I was emotionally invested in working there, and it just broke my heart to know that I would never be good enough to do so. So how did the process of actually applying for this company come to be? Well, initially I saw a job posting on LinkedIn. I sent them my resume, and then one of their employees got in contact with me and he asked if I was interested in doing their coding test. I said yes, and so he sent me a take-home coding test. I did that, and it was good enough to proceed to the next interview, which was a half an hour to 40-minute conversation. It was the screening interview is what they refer to. They want to know, you know, where you're living, what you're doing, what your time schedule is like, what your expected pay is, all those different questions, and whether or not you still want to work for the company. And so everything there went really good. They scheduled me in for the technical interview, which I did last week, and I absolutely failed miserably. And we'll get into that in a bit. So they sent me this take-home coding test that was a header file called person, and part of the header file was a declaration of functions that had to be written, and those implementations of the functions is what I had to do in a separate C++ file. And the functions were things like set mother, set father, add children, remove children, get grandparents, get grandchildren, things of that nature. And so I went through and I did all these different ones. Now, to be completely honest and fair, I haven't touched C++ in several years, because for the past 4 years, I've been almost exclusively focused on developing Unity games using C#. Now, I just assumed or figured that coding languages are like riding a bike, where if you've learned it once, then you know how to do it. And yes, you might be a little bit rusty here and there on the actual technicalities of the language, but you do know it, you have learned it, and so you just need a quick refresher on how to do it. And so I wrote this implementation of this person class. I tested it against a bunch of different things that I had written in a separate main file to test it. I didn't write any specific unit tests the same way that this company wrote unit tests to assess the functionality of the script that I had written, but it functioned and worked perfectly fine, at least on my computer. So I sent it in to them. It was good enough that it passed their test, and it got me to the next stage of the interview, which was the whiteboard interview. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, and I know you're going to say this in the comments below, oh, but why would you be applying for a job with C++, or if I've only been using C# recently? Well, first of all, I don't exclusively apply to jobs with C++. I'll apply to any jobs at all that are there, because at the end of the day, you never know what could happen. You could be the only person that has applied to that job. Now, Granted, I very much doubt that in the current economy, with 10,000 jobs laid off of Google and 12,000 jobs laid off of Meta and 7,000 people fired from Twitter, I very much doubt that I am the only person that has applied to any particular job, regardless of where it is or what it is doing. But I applied to website jobs as well, even though I haven't really touched React code or JavaScript or HTML in several years, but I do know how to use it. And when it comes to C++, it was one of the first languages I learned. Technically, the first language I learned was actually BASIC, on like a VTech toy computer that had a BASIC compiler on it, and it had an instruction manual booklet that I followed to build different apps. Now, I don't say that I really learned that, because I was mostly just typing in whatever was in this instruction booklet, hitting enter and seeing what it did. But then when I was 12 years old, I picked up C++ and started coding with that. And I tried making small games using Allegro and SDL and OpenGL and all those things. I made a program that was like a keyboard tester. It had all the keys on the screen, and if you pressed the key on your keyboard, it would light up, so you could test whether or not a particular key was broken. I don't have access to that anymore because the computer that I wrote that on, I fell asleep with it on the couch and knocked it off, and it hit the ground and the whole thing broke. And then trying to recover the hard drive on a separate computer, I ended up backing up the entire capacity of a 300 gigabyte hard drive into a single text file. But that's a whole nother story for a different day. So I also wrote batch scripts, .bat on a Windows file. I wrote a tic-tac-toe game using batch scripting. And so this is the type of stuff I was doing way back in the day when I didn't know anything about coding. And then when I went to university, I was there for 3 years, and the primary language they taught was C++. So I absolutely do know and understand how to use language. I'm just a little bit rusty on it, okay? Give me a break. So I took this test, and it went fairly well. And then during the whiteboard interview, the first thing they started with was, okay, let's assess this person class that you have written. And there was various edge cases that I had accounted for, like not being able to set yourself as your own father or add yourself as your own children, and things of that nature that I know would absolutely be a breaking of the script. There was a few edge cases, though, that I didn't assess for, and that was their main criticism, was that, oh, well, we ran it through our test and you didn't account for what happens if there's incest. And I'm thinking, oh shit, you're right, I didn't account for that. What happens if you have two siblings and you try to set their children as both their mother and father, so basically it's incest? And so I had never thought of that. I didn't account for that. So then they were asking me, well, what kind of problems does that lead to, other than morally speaking? Obviously, it's illegal. Incest is illegal in the Western world. But other than morally speaking, what's wrong with it? What happens to the code if you allow this to occur? And so I kept thinking about it, and I'm trying to build family trees in my head and recurse up and down the family tree, trying to figure out what the correct answer was. And I couldn't get it. And they were trying to probe me, and they were trying to push me along. It required a lot of guidance. I had guessed randomly that it had maybe caused some infinitely recurring loop somewhere where it would just go around and around and around forever, but that was also not the right answer. I said, nope, it's not an infinite loop. And so then I'm imagining there was one function in particular called get ancestors, which recurses up the family tree, and then it gets all of the people at a particular level, your aunts and uncles, as well as your cousins, and then your grandparents, and it continues to recurse up. And then I thought, oh, that's the problem. The problem is that if you get your uncle, who is also your father, and you get your aunt, who's also your mother, you're going to get duplicates in your data set. And they said, there you go, that's the right answer. And so everything up until this point had gone fairly well, I think. This is the point where it started to fall apart. You see, they asked me, well, how is it that you would change your code to ensure that there are no duplicates in the data set? Because at this point I was using vectors to store lists of persons. And I knew exactly what the correct answer was. The answer is to use a hash set in C#. And this is kind of where everything began to fall apart, because I didn't remember what the exact equivalent of a hash set was in C++, which is the language that we're using. So if you don't know what a hash set is, in C# you have a list, which is just a list of variables, and you have a hash set, which is a unique list of variables. So let's say you have a list of integers, and you put the number 1 into that list 100 times. You're going to end up with a list that is 100 items long, and they're all going to be the number 1. If you put that 1 100 times into a hash set, you're only going to get one instance of 1. There's only ever going to be one instance of that number in the entire hash set because it is unique. The equivalent of a hash set in Unity is a data structure called unique. I didn't quite remember that, even though I've used it before and I knew exactly what its purpose and functionality was. So I'm trying to remember, and I'm hemming and hawing, and I told them it's been a while since I've used C++. I told them honest to God truth, I don't remember what the equivalent of it is, but I know in C# it's a hash set, it's a unique list of characters, and again, this is where things started to break apart, because list in C++ is a specific data structure that is different than everything else. It typically refers to a linked list. And so they're like, oh, list, are you referring to linked list? And I'm like, no, I'm referring to list in C#, which is the equivalent of a vector array in C++. So then they're like, oh, you're talking about an array. And I was like, okay, yes, an array of values that is unique. You need to use a data structure that's an array of values that's unique to get it. And so it was technically the correct answer, but they kind of cringed at it. And this is kind of where things started to fall apart. You see, the very next problem that they told me with the logic that I had written was actually the destructor on the class. Now, I'm going to put a snippet of code up here on the screen for you to see. This is the declaration of the person for mother and father in the header file. And in the implementation, you can see in my destructor, I'm deleting the references to the pointers and setting them null. Now, I will admit, it's been several years since I learned this in school. But from what I remember learning in school, under every circumstance where you are referring to a pointer, which is denoted by these asterisks at the end of the person, you need to delete the pointer and then set it to null in the destructor. Otherwise, you run into the problem of overusing your memory, using so much memory that it never gets cleared out, and then your computer runs out of memory. And so that's typically what's referred to as a memory leak. You need to free that memory to be used. But the problem is that they told me that when they ran this through their unit test, it broke the entire system, basically, and froze their computer, and they had to actually comment out the destructor to make it function correctly, which was weird considering I also ran it through some tests that I had built in a separate class, and when the destructor was called, there was never any problem at all, at least on my end. And so they were asking me, well, do you see what the issue is? Like, do you understand why you can't do that? And like, why did you do this? And so I told them, I was told in university that every time you're encountering a pointer, when you're done with it, you need to free that memory. And they were like, yeah, but the memory was never allocated in the first place because the difference is it's on like the stack versus the heap. And the moment they said stack and heap, I knew I was way up Schitt's Creek and way underwater and way over my head because I don't remember the difference between the stack and the heap. I'm not stupid. I did learn it 8 years ago in school, and it's been at least 6 years since I last had to know it, but I just didn't remember it. So they're asking me, oh, well, you know the difference, right, between the stack and the heap? And I'm like, oh, yes, it's been several years. I learned it once. I don't remember. And I'm trying to picture these diagrams out of a textbook in my head where it's like, this is a stack and this is a heap. And there's like data somehow moving between them. And so I was trying to describe to them, it's like a way of organizing how the memory and the hardware is set up, where it's like certain variables get stored on the stack and certain other variables get stored on the heap. But I don't remember the circumstances under how and why each variable gets stored. And even right now, I genuinely don't know what is wrong with this code. So if you're someone who's more up to date and versed in C++, maybe you can let me know in the comments below what I did wrong, why this doesn't work. But I swear, as much as I can remember, every instance that you're using a pointer, you have to delete it and set it to null. Otherwise, you run into a stack overflow. You run into a memory leak issues. And so they're telling me, no, you can't do that because it's already not been allocated. And I was absolutely confused out of my mind. And they could tell that I was not very well versed in what they were asking me to do. And I can already hear the critics in the comments saying, oh, why would you even be bothering applying for a AAA studio that uses C++ when you know that you haven't touched this language in years, and you know that you've forgotten these fundamentals that are taught in every first-year computer science class? And it's like, well, you know, I applied to many jobs. I applied to jobs with Unity and C# that if I had done those coding tests, I would probably exceed very well at, because I'm using it on a daily basis as opposed to C++, which I haven't touched in several years. And just for those who are in the audience who are not coders or technically inclined or know the difference between them, C++ is a very old and outdated language that was written in 1986. It's almost 40 years old. And yes, I know it's gotten its updates over the years that have made it more modernized and that. But when it comes to C#, I personally prefer C#. I think it's a much cleaner language. I think it's a much nicer language to use. I think it's much more human readable. It's not as technically inclined. It doesn't break as often if you just forget one particular thing. There's something that I refer to with C++ that I know as linker hell, which is where you can spend an hour and a half in the Microsoft Visual Studio's environment just trying to set it up so that files can see each other. You don't get that problem at all. Not at all. In Unity. You can make a C# script in Unity and put that sucker anywhere you want in your project, and it can be called from any other script, any other place in your project. You don't have to reference the specific file or the header file that it's located in and then point to the exact directory where to find it. Because in C#, it has namespaces. In Unity, or sorry, in C++, it also has namespaces, and you use the using keyword, almost like the import keyword for Python, to call in stuff from that namespace. But there's an additional step that you need to do in C++ because you have to point to that specific header file as well. So now you have to use the precompiler tag #include, link to the file, and then using the namespace that you want to get the class out of before you can actually use it. Whereas it's a much simpler and easy process to use with C#. So I know people are saying, oh, well, you shouldn't be applying for these jobs if you just don't remember this stuff about C++. I've applied to jobs for Unity. I've applied to jobs that use C++. In fact, there was one job in particular for a company called LuckyVR that's doing this VR-related casino-type software. It actually seemed pretty cool, to be completely honest. And I did an interview there twice. I interviewed with them twice because the first time I had applied for the job, it had said on the list of requirements, there was a nice to have section. They'll sometimes do that. These are the requirements you need to know for the job. These are the nice to haves. And in the nice to have section was experience building multiplayer games. You see, I've never built a multiplayer game before. Not that I can't learn how to do it, but the problem is that they're looking for someone who already has that experience and knows what to do. So because of that, I didn't get hired for that job. And they said, oh, you don't have multiplayer experience. I'm sorry, but if you're going to solely base your decision on whether or not you hire someone on the nice to have section, that nice to have section needs to be made part of the requirements. Otherwise, I filled all the requirements and I met every single one of them, other than, I'm sorry, I don't have experience building multiplayer games. And so, because I actually thought the company was decent and doing some good work, I thought, I don't know, I'll go on their job site and see what else they have that doesn't require multiplayer. So I found an architecture position and I applied to that job, and I got an interview with the same person who had initially told me that I wasn't going to proceed to the next stage of the interview. And I don't know if there was any particular miscommunication amongst the HR team or my recruiter who contacted me on LinkedIn about this position and actually doing the interview with this guy, but I interviewed with him, and the way he was talking almost seemed like they hadn't at all told me no, at least initially, because he was like, oh, it's after Christmas now, and we just want to make sure you're still interested in this job position, and we want to make sure that you want to work for us still. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, you guys told me no, and then I applied to this other position that I thought would better be suited to my skills, and he's like, oh, yeah, that's okay, whatever, we'll move you on to the next stage, we'll do the technical coding interviews, we'll get you in to see someone, and then he contacted me back and he said no, that they were not going to be proceeding with the interview. So don't fucking tell me we're going to the next step if you're going to contact me 3 days later and tell me the answer is no. But you know, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I thought, okay, maybe they already had the position filled or someone was already lined up almost ready to be hired for the position, and it just didn't work out. He didn't give me a reason the second time why the answer was no, even though I met all the qualifications. I don't know, maybe I didn't have enough experience on my resume to showcase my ability to architecture software, and so maybe that was it. So giving them the benefit of the doubt, I applied for a third time to this LuckyVR company for a UI UX position that didn't have anything to do with architecture. It didn't once mention multiplayer experience, so I figured, oh, perfect, I'll be able to get this job. And considering both interviews with the same person went very well, at least from my perspective, I thought there was a genuine interest in my ability to work for this company. And then this Riley person contacted me back and straight up said, nope, we're not interested at all. No interview at all. Which, if we were on good terms in the first two interviews, you think he would contact me for a third interview for this other position. But nope, just outright denied. So you know what? Fuck you, Riley, you stupid cunt. I didn't want to work for your goddamn company anyways. So I can't seem to understand why it is that the jobs that I would probably be able to pass their coding test, because it's with C# and Unity, they don't even want to fucking interview me. And the jobs that do want to interview me want me to regurgitate all this technical knowledge about C++ that I just don't remember. So there was two people that were conducting this interview. One of them was kind of more senior. He seemed a bit older, more like the technical lead. And the other guy was fairly younger as a coder. He seemed maybe my age, maybe just slightly older. I don't know, 27, 28 years old if I had to guess. And it was the younger guy who was like, oh, I can see that you're kind of rusty on your C++ and you're not really getting it. You're mixing C# with C++. And so let's move on to the next question that's not related specifically to the language. And I'm thinking, oh, thank God, please, 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 let's move on to the next question. And at this point, we're only 20 minutes maybe into the interview. The entire interview lasted a full hour and a half. So just keep that in mind, that for the next hour and a half, I got my ass absolutely handed to me. And I got so emotional to the point that I nearly broke down and cried. And now you understand why. Because they could have simply just stopped and given me mercy at this point, as they are probably already made up their decision at this early on. 20 minutes into the interview, they already knew that they were going to tell me no. But no, we had to go for another hour and 10 minutes of these grueling questions, dragging my ass through hell, trying to answer them, just so that they could tell me no anyways. So the fact that they didn't give me mercy was kind of disparaging. Now, the thing you have to understand about the technical whiteboard interview is that in order to get good at them and pass a technical whiteboard interview, you have to do a lot of them, which is why I am so pissed off that companies don't start with this. They tend to start with some kind of bullshit screening process that's like, oh, what's your work schedule? What's your desired pay? Where do you live? Are you willing to relocate? What's your time zone? Blah, 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 blah. And then it goes like 3 or 4 interviews, and maybe they even have an at-home coding test. At this point, you've now invested 5 hours in researching the company, applying for the company, writing cover letters, doing the technical test, doing 1, 2, 3 pre-stage interviews just to get to the whiteboard test, just to fail it because you don't have any experience doing a whiteboard test. This is the first whiteboard test of this nature that I have done in the last 3.5 years. Every place that I've applied, I have done coding interviews before. I have done pre-screening interviews before. It has been 3.5 years since I last did a technical whiteboard interview being monitored by other people live, where I have to regurgitate my answers in front of them. And so, of course I failed because I don't have an experience doing it. So what a company needs to do, if they're going to base their entire hiring decision on can you remember these arbitrary questions we pulled from some university textbook, they need to start with that. They need to start with the whiteboard interview, and then if you fail it, at least you've gotten the experience of what you don't know, so that way you can go and practice and get better at it. And I'm sorry, doing questions on Algo.io is not good enough, because it doesn't tell you and it doesn't teach you how you're going to behave, how you're going to operate under the pressure of having people sit there and watch you code. And I understand that companies have limited resources and their coders are already overworked, and they're not going to want to take staff off the coding team to go and conduct a whiteboard interview for every applicant that comes through. But I'm sorry, it is the company's responsibility. It is the company that has put themselves in this position. It is the company that has decided that they are looking to hire someone. So likewise, if they're going to want you to come into the headquarters to do an interview with the CEO before you get hired, it is the company's responsibility to pay your plane fare and pay for you to come out for the day to do that interview. It is not your job to pay for the plane to fly to their headquarters so you can interview with the CEO. So if it's the company that's utilizing their resources to hire you, then it is the company that is responsible to allocate their programmers in such a way that they're able to actually conduct these interviews with the people that they're interviewing. So moving on, we went to the second question, and although the second question was not specifically pertaining to the exact syntax and logic of how C++ works, it was specifically related to memory. And so in a roundabout way, it technically is a C++ question, because memory and memory management is just something you don't have to worry about at all in C#. And that's why C# is a far better language. You don't have to worry about garbage collection, and you don't have to worry about memory management. Let's say, as a hypothetical, I want to make a game where the objective of the game is to, wash puppies. I'm gonna start by writing a script where I have an integer. I want to record the number of puppies that have been washed. And then I'm going to write a function that is going to wash the puppies, and when it's done, it's going to increase that number of puppies washed by 1. It makes no difference to me at all where on the hardware that data is stored. Whether that integer is stored here, or over there, it fucking works. It doesn't matter to me at all where that data is stored. But in C++, you have to explicitly understand how and where the data is stored. And so C# doesn't force you to think about memory at all, and C++ does. If you're mostly coding in C#, you're going to entirely forget how memory and memory management works, because it's not relevant in the modern coding atmosphere to know. You can make an entire game in Unity from start to finish and publish it on Steam and never once have to know the difference between heap and stack memory. And I understand there are a lot of coders that are going to say, well, C++ is a more powerful language because it gives you that ability to go right to the root of the problem and resource from this particular memory block at that particular location the exact data that is being held there. I will tell you, from my experience of a decade worth of making games, I have never once had to know the exact value of a data stored at its exact specific position in memory. There is almost no circumstances at all ever in the context of game development where you're going to have to know the exact specific data at a specific block in memory. It's entirely irrelevant unless you were doing some extremely advanced, low-level, grinding on metal debugging where you would have to know that data. It just doesn't fucking matter. So the second question they asked me was about the specifics of how a hash table works. Now, a hash table, if you don't know, is a way of allocating data where there's a key and there's a value. The key is a unique identifier that points to that particular value. In C#, this is what we know as a dictionary. There's various different types of hashing algorithms, but the most commonly used one, at least in Unity game development, is a dictionary, where you have a key that's unique and it points to a particular value. The key can be anything, the value can be anything. So if I want to make a list of images, let's say, or sprites that we want to use in a UI and swap them out dynamically, and one of it is a frog, and one is a cat, and one is a dog, we make at the key frog the picture of a frog, at the key cat a picture of a cat, at the key dog a picture of a dog. And I don't have to know at all how that is stored in memory. I just have to say, go get me the picture of a frog. Boom, there's a picture of a frog. Go get me the picture of a dog. Boom, there's a picture of a dog. I don't have to know anything about the hashing algorithm, how it's stored in data, why it is that the lookup time in a dictionary is near instantaneous. It's like, if I remember, O1 in terms of big O notation complexity. So they're asking me, well, can you explain why it is that a hashing table has a lookup time of O to the 1 complexity? And it's like, frick if I know. I learned that 7 or 8 years ago in school, and I've never had to know it since. So it's not relevant to me in my day-to-day job to know the exact specifics of how or why a hashing table has a lookup time of O to the 1 in big O notation. I just have to know that it does. And I do. And that doesn't impact my ability to perform a job or to do a task or to program something that works, because I just don't know the specifics of how a hashing table algorithm works. So I'm trying to guess. I'm like, okay, well, they take a value that's the key and it goes to the hashing algorithm, and then you get another value that is entirely unique. And then they're like, okay, what do you do with that value? And I'm like, I guess it points to like a position in memory. And they're like, yeah, no, if you took that data that came out of the hashing algorithm and you just pointed to that memory block, then you just get some random piece of memory. And it's like, okay, sure. So then there has to be some kind of table, I guess, it's a hashing table, of course, that allocates that this particular key points to that particular block in memory. And they're like, okay, how do you do that? And I'm like, frick if I know. I don't fucking remember. And this is right in the point of the interview, right halfway through the interview, maybe 40 minutes in, when a comment was made that really rubbed me the wrong way. It absolutely pissed me right the fuck off. When the one person said, well, you do make games, right? And just the way that it was worded, the tone of his voice, the insinuation that an entire decade's worth of work just didn't fucking happen. Because I'm sorry, I just don't remember right now at the forefront of my brain the difference between stack and heap memory. I guess that just means I'm an idiot. I just don't know how to make games, because I'm sorry, I can't remember some algorithm for a hashing table that was taught to me once and I've never had to know since. But just the way, like I said, the way that it was worded, it was like this kind of skeptical, snarky narcissism. They just couldn't possibly believe that I had ever made any games at all. And if I was smart, I would have just hung up on them right there. I just said, you know what? Fuck you guys, I'm done. If you're gonna sit there and insinuate that an entire decades of work just didn't happen, and I said to them, yeah, I make games. I build lots of complex systems. I build state machines and input systems and character controllers and saving and loading logic and UI and UX logic and all these things. And I told them I've never had to know in an entire decades of work. I've never once had to know the difference between heap and stack memory. I've never once had to know the exact specifics of how a hashing algorithm works. And I told them I know how to make games and I've done it before. I just have never had to know this specific stuff related to the specific questions. And you know, I'm sorry that I just happened to forget some first year university logic that was taught to me 8 years ago and I've never had to know since. That doesn't mean that I'm not a good coder. That doesn't mean that I can't be productive. That doesn't mean that I'm incapable of making a game from start to finish, or implementing different systems or functions or logic of any kind, or going to Google to figure out something that I don't know. And this is what I was trying to explain to my dad in the context of him being a mechanic of nearly 40 years, if not more. And I said to him, do you know exactly how an engine is built from scratch? The exact composition of the metal alloys, the temperature that the metal is melted at, the time that it has to cool in the mold before it's ready to be removed. No, of course not. He doesn't know that information, but that doesn't mean that he can't perform his job as a mechanic and fix the engine when it breaks. I don't have to know the exact specifics and technicalities and mathematical equations behind how my computer works to know how to use it and how to make games that function. Now, I know some people in the comments are going to argue, but you absolutely have to know that information. It's good to know. It's nice to have. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, you should actually know that information. And I suppose it's nice to have information the same way that it's nice to know random facts about how the internet works. But I don't have to have complete knowledge of the operation of how the internet works to know how to go on the internet and use it. I don't have to have complete knowledge of how every circuit and wire in my phone is put together to know how to use my phone. Likewise, my dad doesn't have to know everything about the construction of how an engine was made to know how to go and fix it. And you know, if you're going to say to someone, you know what, you're just not good enough to work for our company because you just didn't remember these highly specific questions, these highly specific topics that were pulled out of a random university textbook. You're just not good enough to work for us. If that's going to be your attitude, well then, fuck you. I'll go take my experience elsewhere. I'll take my knowledge and my skills and my ability to work, and I'll go work for someone who actually gives a damn about what I can do and actually recognizes the talent that I have. You know, I know guys that work in the AAA gaming industry that don't know a damn thing about making games. Because I've asked them before, well, do you know how to make a game from start to finish? No. Have you ever done it? No. Well, I mean, they got hired at a company to do one specific task, and they were trained to do one specific task in the context of making games, and that's all they know how to do. They don't know how to take a game from start to finish. You know what's the one thing that I can actually do? I can make a game from scratch to completion, because I've done it 5 times. 4 mobile games, 3 of which were done when I was 16 and 17 years old in high school. Another mobile game done in the middle of doing university classes. And since coming back from Vancouver in 2020, I released another game to the Unity Asset Store, the Halloween Decoration Sandbox. And I know it's not the best game that had ever been made in the history of ever. It's an asset store flip game. I'm sorry, I don't have an army of 3D modelers at my disposal. I know that it is lacking a lot of features and that it's full of bugs and that it's not really complete or finished at all. I'm sorry, I don't have an army of coders at my disposal to work for me. I am the only one working on this project, and I try to allocate as best I can my time to this project amongst working on 6 or 7 other projects, none of which pay me at all because nobody wants to pay me to do a damn thing. But I can do a lot of coding. I'm not specialized in any one particular area. And I know that the game is not the best game ever, but it would be good enough, I would assume, that if you put it on your resume, a company, at least any company that's decent enough, would see that and say, hey, look at this guy. He has the skills and the ability to make a game from scratch. He might not be the smartest. He might not have multiplayer experience. He might not remember the specifics of a hashing algorithm. But you know what? We can hire him, and we can train him, and we can teach him the things that he didn't know or that he just didn't remember, and train him to a point that he would be a very highly productive employee. But nobody wants to do that. No company wants to hire someone at a lower level position or a junior position and train them up. And if you don't believe me, go on LinkedIn right now and go to the jobs tab, type in software developer. No context, just software developer. Senior, lead, senior tech lead, senior. I don't know about you, senior. I don't know about you, but I haven't yet to see a junior position listed. And you will scroll from the top to the bottom down. Everything is senior. And if you still don't believe me that junior software developer roles just don't exist anywhere at all, type in specifically junior software developer. Hit enter. The first thing listed is senior. Senior. Lead iOS developer, senior. Where's the junior positions? Scroll down and you will see nothing but senior, lead developer, senior, tech lead developer, senior, all the way down. So I'm sorry if you think I'm an idiot for applying for a senior developer position and then getting mad that I'm not senior enough because I just don't remember the senior shit. I'll gladly work at a junior level position. I don't give a damn what my job title is, but the junior positions don't exist at all. So what am I left to do but apply for the senior positions and then have my heart crushed and broken because I'm not good enough to be a senior level developer? So that brings us to the third question that was on this coding exam. This is a 4-question exam. It lasted an hour and a half long. And the third question is probably the one that I did the best on, although still not particularly great. And it was about a binary search tree where there was 2 positions in the tree, A and B, and A was up here somewhere and B was down here somewhere. And the question was, how would you go about finding the common ancestor that A and B share? And I thought about it and they said, don't worry about complexity, don't worry about the best solution, the best possible algorithm that had ever been written, just brute force whatever comes to mind. And I thought, okay, well, if you start at A and you work all the way up to the root of the tree and you build a list of their ancestors, and then you start at B and you work all the way up to the root of the tree and you build a list of their ancestors, if you find the intersection of those 2 lists at the lowest point, you find the common ancestor that both of them share. And they were like, oh, well, that's interesting that you brought up intersection and list and that. I said, but there's a problem with this algorithm. It requires memory to store the data in the list. So how could you improve the algorithm to make it not require memory? So then I was thinking about, well, I don't really know how I would go about doing this to not use memory and store references to positions in the search tree. And so then they were thinking about, is there something that you could do to the tree before you applied any operation? And I remember that there's often a lot of algorithms where you can cut out half of the data and just say that it's entirely irrelevant based on some rule or principle of the algorithm. So I'm trying to remember some rule or principle that I can use where I can just lob off half of the search tree and just ignore that entire half. And I was like, well, if it was a sorted search tree and you knew that both values were above a particular value, you could like do a sort down the tree and then lob off half of the tree that's like less than the value. And they're like, yeah, but it's not a sorted search tree. It's just an arbitrary binary tree. And I was like, okay, well, if it's not sorted, then I couldn't think of it there. And then obviously they had to coach me a lot to get to the right answer. And the right answer was, if you start at the position that is highest in the tree, then you can be guaranteed that nothing below that is a shared common ancestor. So because A is highest in the tree, we'll chop off A, we'll bring B up to the point that they're at the same level, and then we'll start the algorithm to recurse upwards. And it's like, okay, but then how would you determine the depth of each node in the tree? And I'm like, well, you'd have to count all the way down, and then I guess you'd record some number, but it's like, okay, well, now you're using memory again to record the number of steps you have to traverse down the tree to get to where that particular node is. You take the minimum of the two values and you start at that position. So then they were like, okay, is there some way that we can simplify this now that A and B are at the same level? And I'm like, well, okay, what if they're at the same level? Then that means that the immediate ancestor is the shared common one. Well, no, because there's other nodes on the other side of the tree. So what if B is on the other side of the tree? And it was like, okay, well, okay, if that's the case, then what we would have to do is start from the root node. And they kept asking me like, well, what if you started at the bottom with the children, all the leaf nodes at the bottom? And I was like, I don't remember. And so then I was trying to find like the difference between them, and I'm completely blanking even now on what the exact answer was. I did technically get the correct answer, but it required a lot of coaching from them. And I think one of the reasons that the binary search tree was the one question in the entire test that I did reasonably okay on was that when you go to university, almost every single algorithm that is ever taught is almost exclusively taught in the context of binary search trees and visual graphs. Almost all of them are taught in the context of how do you search or how do you sort a binary search tree and how do you traverse through a graph. So you would expect, if it was such a big part of university and schooling to know and understand binary search trees, that it would appear virtually everywhere in the real world when it comes to coding. That's just, nope, it's not the case. Again, I have spent a decade building games, and I have never once, not once in my life, had to use a binary tree of any kind at all ever in my games. Again, I find myself in this situation where they're asking me questions that don't seem to have any relevancy at all to coding in reality and in the real world, outside of questions that are seen on a university quiz. So then, finally, the final question in this interview, at this point I'm almost in tears, was specifically entirely math related. You can ask this question in the context of math in a hypothetical world where computers never existed at all, and you could still ask this as a question. And what the question was about finding whether or not a position was within your particular field of view. Typically characters, obviously you have a field of view. You can see at a particular angle out the sides of your eyes. You can't see behind you. And so we want to replicate that logic in a video game. How do you go about doing that? Well, the problem is that in the context of math, there is only ever one correct answer. There are varying degrees of correct answer, but there's only ever one correct answer when it comes to math. And if you frame it in the context of math, that's the way you're going to live your life, is just assume that there's only ever one way to do things. When it comes to coding, there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat. So let's say, for example, in the context of implementing this field of view question in Unity, I can think of one immediately off the top of my head way. It might not be the best. It may not be the most performant. It may not be the simplest or the easiest or the fastest solution to implement. But at the end of the day, the only correct answer in coding is whatever works is the correct answer. So in Unity, you have a lot of different tools. You have meshes and you have colliders. And so you could build, say, a cone mesh that extends in front of your character as their field of view. And then you can turn the mesh render off so that it's invisible in game, but you keep the mesh render, or you keep the mesh filter on with a collider on the mesh. And then as you're panning around with the camera, as your character's rotating, you just detect, did an enemy enter into that trigger collider? Add it to the list. If you turn and they enter out of it, you remove it from the list. Did an object enter your field of view? Add it to the list. Did you turn and it exited? Remove it from your list. It might not be the best solution, but it'll work. And like I said before, the biggest problem with coding interviews is that they don't relate at all to what you would do in the typical world. So if my boss came to me and said, Evan, can you implement this field of view problem? We need something to detect whether or not an enemy or a character is within your field of view. I'll say, sure thing, Mr. Boss Man. I've never done it before. I have no idea how to do it. Let me Google it. And then you go on Google, how to do field of view in Unity, how to do field of view in Unreal. And you spend 2 seconds on Stack Overflow and find out, oh, the solution to the problem is the dot product. Well, you know what? I learned about the dot product in university, but the way that university classes are taught is that it only ever teaches you the tool. It never teaches you how to apply the tool. This is what a lot of people need to understand about math problems, is that a math question is not actually one question. It's 2 questions in one. The first part of the question is, can you identify the problem and the particular tool that applies to this problem? And then now that you know the correct tool to use, can you actually implement that tool to use the problem? And all that university ever taught was the use of the tool. They said, this is the dot product, this is how it works, this is the equation, let's break it down, let's prove this, let's prove that. There was never any instance at all where we were shown a practical use of the dot product. So if you spend 3 classes learning the dot product and then you go to do a test on whatever you just learned, it's like, gee, I wonder what's on the test. Does it have anything to do with the last 3 classes we spent learning the dot product? Oh, hey, here's a math question. I wonder what the solution is. Let's use the dot product. But when you're given an arbitrary math question where any number of thousands and hundreds of thousands of mathematical tools can be applied to it, and you just don't know because you've never been shown or it's never been seen to you before, you're just supposed to reach into the universe and manifest out of magic that the dot product is the correct answer. And so if a company is going to set their baseline as you have to have complete knowledge of everything in technology that has ever been invented since the history of technology, then how is anyone ever going to pass a coding interview? Because unless you have the knowledge of God just at the forefront of your brain, you're going to forget something. And this is the problem. This dot product field of view thing, I'll never, ever forget that algorithm now for the rest of my life because of the absolute humiliation that I was put through. I'll learn that algorithm inside out and upside down. I'll have it memorized and seared onto the forefront of my brain. And then you know what'll happen now that I actually know the algorithm? I'll never see another instance for the rest of my life where I have to know how to implement a field of view using a dot product. Because there is 100,000 million other technical questions that could possibly be asked or that have ever been asked in the history of forever. And they're going to ask those and I'm not going to know because I just didn't learn it or I've never seen it before. And so they even told me, oh, you have to use the dot product. And they were trying to lead me on, right, to get to the right answer. And I just genuinely didn't know how to do that. I knew about the dot product. I remember that it had to do something between relations of vectors and how they relate, and like it's one value if they're pointing in the same direction, and it's another value if they're perpendicular, and it's another value if they're directly opposite. And the correct answer, by the way, is if it's 1, the result of the dot product, vectors are pointing in the same direction. If it's 0, they're perpendicular to each other. And if it's -1, they're directly opposing to each other. I just didn't remember that. And so I'm trying to explain to them, I remember the dot product. It had something to do with perpendicular angles. And they're like, perpendicular angles? What are you talking about? And so I'm completely failing. And I just absolutely did not know at all how to do this. And I'm thinking about solutions and coming up with algorithms. And I'm sure I could have implemented something on paper or in a function or in a class. It might have been 40 lines of code instead of one mathematical equation, but it would have worked. And so, of course, I failed. And then after that, they were like, no, we're not even gonna. That was scheduled for 2 interviews that day. One was an hour-and-a-half long technical interview, followed by another hour-long interview on, whether you're a good company fit and you can work here and everything. And they didn't even do the second interview because they just said no. They were just like, And I even asked them, like, oh, do you have like other positions within the company where I'd be better suited, more creative kind, more junior positions where you don't have to know all this technical stuff that I just don't know? And they're like, no, I see you. Thanks for wasting an hour and a half with your time, and again, this is on top of, hours of preparation and doing the pre-coding test. I spent 3 hours writing the person class, and they asked me, well, how long did you spend doing this? And I always hate those questions because if you answer too long, like, oh, I spent 7 hours doing it, they're like, 7 hours? This guy doesn't really know what he's doing. He's gonna spend, how is that gonna look when you spend 7 hours on everything that you have to program? Or if you said, oh, I spent 10 minutes, it's like, oh, yeah, well, either one of 2 answers is probable. Either you're a savant who just knows everything and you can code that fast, and you really are that smart, or you just didn't really care that much, in which case it shows little to no interest at all in working in the company. And so you just kind of did it as fast as possible, not even caring what you were doing. So I told them 3 hours, and they seemed to indicate that that was kind of on the faster side, like, oh yeah, that was done pretty quickly. And so I've wasted 3 hours plus an hour interview plus all the research I did on the company. Like I said, I knew about them. I didn't know a lot about their history and how they came to be and all that nature. I watched everything I could YouTube-wise in terms of videos on the company, and then they just told me no. And this is where it gets into the argumenting and the fighting and the infighting, because I immediately, as I tend to do when I'm upset, I go and I start fights with people, and I'm arguing with other coders in a group chat I am with, the coders, and they're like, oh, well, if you just didn't know these algorithms, then what happens if the company hires you and then they have you implement some algorithm? And a lot of these companies, these big AAA companies, they have like data requirements with their cloud computing, and if you do the algorithm wrong, then it could cost the company millions of dollars per month. And I'm like, okay, fine. If that is your argument to make, is that if you don't know a particular algorithm or the fastest or the simplest way to do things using a single line math, the dot product, then there needs to be a particular willingness for a company to hire you at a junior position and then train you up and say, hey, look, you don't know these things. Let me teach it to you. How am I supposed to know that the dot product is the answer to implementing the field of view question when I've never seen it before in a decade worth of game development? Not once. And the problem is if I had to figure it out, I'd go on Google, do 2 minutes of searching, and I'd find out that the dot product is copy, paste, boom, put it in the code. I don't have to know anything about the dot product or how it works. Just know that if I put that here, everything works. Alternatively, if a company is not willing to hire you and train you to understand these things, then don't put the new guy in charge of writing an algorithm, which if done incorrectly would cost the company millions of dollars. That's just called common fucking sense. Don't put the new guy in charge of writing algorithms that if done incorrectly will cost you millions of dollars. Put some senior guy in charge of it. And I'm pretty sure that they already do. You're not going to get hired as the new guy. At least at any decent company, you're not going to get hired as the new guy and immediately thrust into the deep end of writing some algorithm and told, oh, by the way, if you get this wrong, it's going to cost us $10 million extra in budgeting operations. Like I said to my dad, as a mechanic, imagine if you went to mechanic school and they taught you how to use a socket wrench. This is how to take it apart. This is how to change the bits. This is how to hold it. This is how to use it. But they never once showed you where on the car the socket wrench connects with the various nuts and bolts. And so your boss comes to you, he gives you a socket wrench and says, hey, here you go fix the car. And the next thing you know, your boss comes back 5 minutes later and he's yelling at you because you're using a socket wrench to remove the bolts on the tire instead of an impact drill. It's like, well, gee, what am I supposed to do? Sorry that I was just never shown where to properly use this tool. And if you just don't believe me that it's not that big of a deal to write the most performant code that had ever been written in the history of forever, then I implore you to go and watch Gaming with Gabe's video about why big O notation often lies to developers about performance. Because what you need to understand about the big O notation is it's a trend of what happens when datasets approach infinity. And almost never, unless you're dealing with like cutting edge mathematics or on the forefront of physics, are you ever going to have to deal with a number approaching infinity. And he proved this in his video where he used a real data set, the size of a data set taken from a real video game, Minecraft, and he compared the quote-unquote poorly written slow algorithm to the quote-unquote performant fast algorithm. And the difference between the two was like 8 microseconds for the slow algorithm and 1.3 microseconds for the fast algorithm. Basically negligent. I saw another video recently by a guy named Johnny Harris, where he was talking about his experience of learning language as he took 4 years in a minor in French. And he was talking about recently learning Italian and how to speak Italian. And he was comparing it to a video game map where there's all these challenges and things you have to learn and problems you have to solve to get to the end goal. And the way that university teaches language in that particular context is that if it's not like perfectly grammatically correct, then it's wrong. If you can't read the literature, if you don't know like the history of the language and how it came to be, then you're doing it wrong. When at the end of the day, he pointed out that the end goal is to have a conversation with someone. And you don't have to know all these technical things to make it technically correct to be able to have a fluent conversation with someone in a foreign language where they would understand you. And so he created this new system where they only focus on exactly the most important information that you need to know to make fluent conversation with someone in a foreign language. And he proved that in a matter of 6 weeks of using his new system, never having learned Italian before, he was more conversationally fluent in Italian after 6 weeks than he was after 4 years of taking a minor in French. And if that's not a damning indictment against the modern education system, then I don't know what is. Now you compare that to coding. There is a lot of technicalities and a lot of things that can be learned and a lot of algorithms that should be known to be technically correct, the most performant and the most efficient that has ever existed forever. Do you need to know them all to make a game? No. Do you need to have them all in the forefront of your brain to pass a coding test? Yes, but once you pass that coding test, are you going to use them in your day-to-day job? Probably not. So that is essentially the gist of my rant, is that companies use coding tests to weed out people based on arbitrary rules, and the only people that can pass these tests are people that just memorize it. And if you're really good at memorization, great, you'll get an A+ in university. Does that mean you ever know anything or know how to use it? Not particularly, because university focuses exclusively on the use of the tool and not where it is applied. So that's about the end of everything I have to say. I'm starting to lose my voice. Thank you. If you've made it this far in the video, please let me know in the comments below if this has been your experience applying for jobs and failing interviews. If there's anyone out there who is looking to hire someone who knows what they're doing, but they might not know everything, if you're in the position to hire, if you know people that are looking to hire for a talented games developer who is extremely passionate about what they do and has a decade worth of experience, and you don't care about the specific technicalities of what I do or do not know, feel free to reach out. My email address is right there. You can send me an email, let me know that you watched my video, and we'll talk. Maybe it'll lead to something. I don't know. Other than that, I thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.